Hi, my name's Venora, and my family erased me. Not all at once, no. It started with a missing photo, then a silence that grew roots. They told the town I'd abandoned them. They sold my memories, gave away my medals, and when I came home, the only seat left at the table wasn't mine. They didn't just try to forget me, they rewrote the story without me in it. But how do you fight back when the people who erased you share your last name? When the fire comes not from outside, but from your own childhood home, would you still call that home? Because I did, and I came back, not to stay quiet. Are you ready to hear the truth they tried to burn? The leaves hadn't even begun to crisp fully, but the Oregon air already held that stubborn bite of early autumn. I rolled down the window just slightly, letting the cool breeze hit my face as I pulled into the driveway of my father's home. Eden sat quietly in the back seat, clutching her sketch pad, her little fingers stained with markers. She looked up at the two-story suburban house with an expression too blank for an 8-year-old. I smoothed the front of my dress uniform, making sure every crease was still sharp, every button aligned. It was the same uniform I'd worn through 8 deployments, 2 ceremonies, and 1 funeral. It had never betrayed me, unlike the people waiting behind that front door. "This is where Grandpa Arthur lives?" Eden asked. "Yes, baby," I said softly. "That's his house." She looked back down at her sketch pad. I understood the silence. We walked to the front porch together. I rang the doorbell with a hesitation I hadn't felt since boot camp. The door opened, and there she was, Isolde, my stepsister, all pastel lipstick and performative warmth. "Oh, wow," she said with a laugh that didn't touch her eyes. "Still dressing up for attention, huh?" She pulled me into a hug that was more containment than comfort, then turned her saccharine tone toward Eden. "Look at you, sweetheart." So big. Arthur appeared behind her, his eyes resting on Eden, skimming over me like I was wallpaper. "Venora," he said with a nod. "Glad you made it." The inside of the house smelled faintly of rosemary and lemon, familiar yet sterile. As I walked past the living room, I noticed the walls. Something was missing. No photos of me, not my Army enlistment, not my high school graduation. Only Isolde's perfect family smiling from Cabo, Aspen, and whatever else was trending that year. I clenched my jaw and followed them into the dining room. The table was set like a Southern living cover, silverware polished, candles flickering, a roast centered like a prize. I pulled out Eden's chair and helped her sit, then took my place across from Isolde. "So," she said as she passed the mashed potatoes, "how long are you gracing us with your presence?" I smiled. "Just until the remembrance event. I thought it was important for Eden to meet the family." "Right," she said, glancing at Arthur. "Because medals are nice, but family dinners are nicer." I watched Eden's fork pause midair. She was listening. I kept my voice level. "I'm here because it matters." Isolde laughed. Sure. Must be nice to wear shiny pins instead of changed diapers, huh?" Arthur didn't say a word, just sipped his wine, looked down at his plate like it held the answers to everything. I swallowed hard. The roast turned to ash in my mouth. I thought about how long silence had been his specialty. Even when Mom was dying, he'd mastered the art of saying nothing until it bled. Midway through dinner, I excused myself to use the bathroom. The hallway hadn't changed. Same beige carpet, same floral mirror. But when I passed the photo wall, I stopped cold. Gone. The photo of me in my graduation gown, the one in fatigues, smiling next to my mother, replaced by Isolde's beach trip in 22, her Christmas card with matching flannel pajamas, as if I'd never existed. I touched the blank space where my face used to be. I wasn't erased by accident. I was deleted on purpose. I returned to the table and sat in silence. Eden leaned over at the end of dinner and whispered, "Mommy, why did Aunt Isolde say you're not family anymore?" I didn't answer, just kissed her forehead and looked up at the slow, spinning ceiling fan. They thought they'd buried me in silence, but they'd forgotten. I was trained to survive deserts, betrayals, and bombs that don't tick. This time, I'm not walking away quiet. The morning light barely reached through the thick Oregon clouds, casting the house in a pale gray that made everything feel colder than it was. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, pulling Eden's tiny sock over her heel, her soft breath steady against my shoulder. Her question from 2 nights ago still echoed in my ears. "Mommy, why did Aunt Isolde say you're not family anymore?" I hadn't answered then. I still didn't have one now. I'd thought about leaving. I'd even packed one of our bags. But then I looked at Eden asleep, hair curled around her cheek like a question mark. Leaving would have given them what they wanted, my silence, my erasure. Again. So I stayed. By the time I walked into the dining room, the laughter had already begun. Isolde's voice, sharp, theatrical, cut through the clinking of dishes. She sat at the head of the table, sipping from a porcelain cup that used to belong to my mother. Pearls dangled from her neck, the ones Mom used to only wear for church or weddings. I hadn't seen those in years. Arthur sat beside her, nodding at something Mrs. Ginny was saying. Local friend of the family, I recalled vaguely. Someone who used to pinch my cheeks too hard as a kid. No one had told me there would be brunch. No one had even knocked on the guest room door. "Morning," I said, not expecting a response but offering civility anyway. No one looked up. Isolde laughed again, louder this time, like she was trying to drown me out. There was one empty chair, but it had Ginny's purse draped over it. I stood behind it, waiting. When no one moved, I reached for the toaster and took a slice of dry bread. I ate standing. Eden wandered in moments later, blinking sleep from her eyes. She tugged on my shirt, and I crouched to her level. "Toast or cereal, baby?" She pointed to the side table where a fancy lacquered chopstick set lay displayed in its box. The gold-tipped pair, our mother's favorite, used to only come out during New Year's. Eden reached toward them with quiet awe. Isolde snatched them away with a speed that startled us both. "Oh no, sweetie, those aren't yours to touch." Eden blinked. I clenched my coffee mug tighter. The china cracked slightly under the pressure, but no one noticed. Arthur cleared his throat, but said nothing. Mrs. Ginny offered a strained chuckle. "Kids and shiny things, huh?" I didn't respond. I couldn't trust my voice. Later, while helping Eden pick up her crayons from the floor near Arthur's study, something caught my eye, an envelope half tucked into a manila folder. The label read, "Thanksgiving Estate Plan, Initial Draft." Probably nothing, but the corner of a check peeked out. I pulled it gently, just enough to see, a blank check, signed by Arthur, made out to I. Maris. No amount filled in. I stared at it for a long time, long enough for Eden to tug my sleeve and ask, "Mommy, are we coloring again?" "Yeah," I whispered. "We're coloring." I slipped the check back exactly as I'd found it. But my pulse thundered in my ears. So that's the price of deletion. A blank check. A trade made not with words, but with silence and dollar signs. That night, after brushing Eden's hair and tucking her in, I stared out the guest room window. The rain started again, tapping against the glass like questions I didn't want to answer. "Mommy?" Eden's voice was soft behind me. "Why does Grandpa pretend he doesn't see you?" I didn't turn, just watched the rain. "Because pretending is easier than admitting you're wrong," I murmured, mostly to myself. She didn't reply, and for the first time since we arrived, neither did I. The storm outside wasn't loud enough to drown out the thoughts in my head. Rain tapped the window in a frantic rhythm, like a Morse code from ghosts I'd long buried. I lay there in the unfamiliar bed, the covers stiff with starch and the scent of someone else's detergent. Sleep was nowhere to be found. I slid out of bed and opened the old duffel bag I always traveled with. Army issue, frayed at the corners, but still intact. From the side pocket, I pulled out a photo frame wrapped in a thin t-shirt for protection. The edges of the frame were worn smooth from years of handling. It was a picture I thought I'd cherished, 10 years ago, right after graduating from officer training school. I remembered standing on the tarmac in Georgia, the heat slick on my skin beneath the crisp uniform, the pride swelling in my chest like a song too big for my body. The picture had arrived in the mail weeks later, Arthur's handwriting on the envelope, neat as ever. I'd always assumed he'd printed it from some official event archive. But tonight, under the pale orange lamp in the guest room, I noticed it for the first time. The edges of the photo didn't quite align. And then I saw her, Isolde. She was in the picture, her hand on my shoulder, but she wasn't there that day. I remembered every detail of that afternoon, and she had been nowhere near Georgia. My throat tightened. The image was doctored. Even in my triumph, I whispered. She rewrote the story. The frame dropped onto the bed as I sat, numb. It wasn't the photo itself. It was what it represented. The rewriting of memory, of legacy, of truth. Every win I thought was mine suddenly felt like it had been quietly co-opted, like my achievements were another family heirloom passed down. But only once Isolde had scrubbed her fingerprints into the gold. Still gripping the photo, I reached for the battered leather journal at the bottom of the bag. The one I'd carried since basic. I flipped through the pages until I found it. The letter. "Dear Dad," it began. My handwriting was shaky. I had written it after lights out, under the covers with a flashlight and too much heart. I told him about the drills, about the camaraderie, about missing Mom's sweet potato pie. I had ended it with, "Tell Eden I'll make her proud." I had copied it into the journal before mailing it. No one ever wrote back. For years, I told myself it got lost. The mail system messed up all the time, right? Maybe it slipped behind a desk. Maybe it was never delivered. But tonight, reading it again, something curdled in my gut. Or maybe, I whispered to the empty room, they got it and ignored it. I pressed my hand against the paper, as though trying to feel the past through the ink. All those years I'd waited for a letter, a note, a message in return, and there was nothing. The pain sat heavy in my chest, not sharp, not anymore. It was a dull, smoldering thing, a coal that refused to die. I stood and walked softly through the dark hallway. The whole house was still, except for the soft purr of the refrigerator and the groan of wood settling in the rain. As I passed Isolde's office, the door was slightly ajar. Her desk lamp still glowed faintly, casting a sliver of light across the carpet. I paused. I didn't step inside. I thought about the folder I saw earlier, the check made out to her, unsigned but full of intent. My feet stayed rooted in place. There was something righteous in the idea of snooping, of finding out everything they were hiding. But something in me recoiled. Instead, I turned toward the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water. The cold faucet bit into my fingers, snapping me back into the now. I leaned against the counter and whispered into the darkness. I need to stop pretending this didn't hurt. There it was. The first admission. Not to Arthur, not to Isolde, not even to Eden, just to the silence. A sound behind me made me stiffen. Soft footsteps. I turned. Not Eden. Isolde. She stood in the hallway, her arms folded, an unreadable look on her face. We locked eyes. I didn't flinch. I nodded, slow, deliberate, said nothing. Then I turned, walked past her, and didn't stop until I reached the guest room. In the mirror above the hallway table, I caught my reflection. Older, tired, but still standing. And behind my eyes, a scream waited. One I'd kept quiet for too long. The sun broke through the last of the storm clouds as I sat on the porch steps, coffee cooling in my hands. After days of rain, the blue above seemed almost defiant. I used to love mornings like this in Oregon, quiet, fresh, alive, but now the stillness gnawed at me. The house behind me creaked, as if deciding whether to wake or stay silent, just like its inhabitants. I replayed last night's moment, Isolde's blank stare meeting mine in the mirror. No remorse, no recognition, just vacancy, a void where sisterhood should have lived. I knew I had to stop pretending. Pretending that this was about oversight or family awkwardness. It was calculated, all of it. My erasure hadn't been passive. It was deliberate, and this morning I was ready to face it. I walked into the kitchen where Arthur stood cracking eggs like the world hadn't shifted under his roof. I asked casually, "Dad, where's Mom's burial flag? The one from her military service?" He paused, then glanced at the pantry like it might be hiding there. "Haven't seen it in years." Isolde packed up the memory boxes, remember? Of course she did. I went straight to the hall closet, pulled out the plastic bin labeled Family Memories in Isolde's overly neat script. Inside, old Christmas cards, faded napkins from birthday parties, and programs from Eden's kindergarten recital. Things with meaning, but none of them mine. I dug deeper until I hit the bottom. No flag. But taped to the underside of the lid was a note. Too damaged to keep. Disposed. Isolde's handwriting again. I stared at those words like they'd punched me in the chest. Too damaged to keep. Was she talking about the fabric? Or me? I carried the box to the study, numb, and dropped it beside Arthur's chair. He looked up from Eden's school enrollment forms, lips parting like he might actually acknowledge what this meant. Then I saw it, tucked between two folders marked Medical Power of Attorney and Estate Distributions. An envelope, yellowed slightly, unopened. It had my name on it. In my mother's handwriting, I reached for it before he could say a word. Arthur began, then cleared his throat. "We thought it was old, misplaced." I turned the envelope in my hands. My name was written like she had whispered it while writing, like love had lived in every stroke. "You thought wrong," I said quietly. "She meant for me to read this before she died. And you let them keep it from me." Arthur didn't respond. He just stared down, his hands trembling slightly on the papers he clung to like shields. That night, I found Isolde in the garage, leaning against the tool bench with a glass of red wine and a cigarette. She flicked ash into an old flower pot like it was a habit born of apathy, not addiction. "I don't need your approval," I said calmly, stepping into the space like I belonged there. "But if you keep erasing me, I promise, I'll make myself unforgettable." She scoffed, taking a slow drag, then exhaled through her nose. "Oh, honey, that's what you said before you shipped out too." My jaw tightened. I stepped closer. "This time I'm not overseas. I'm home, and I'm not quiet anymore." She didn't blink, but something in her shifted, a flicker, whether of recognition, fear, or rage I couldn't tell, and I didn't care. As I walked back inside, I found Eden standing near the hallway, thumb in her mouth, clutching her worn stuffed bunny. "Are you okay, Mommy?" I knelt, wrapped her in my arms, her small frame folded into mine like she belonged there, like home was wherever I held her. "I'm starting to be," I whispered against her hair, and I meant it, even if healing came with bruises, because healing comes at a cost, and I was about to pay it. I still remember the moment I warned Isolde. My words didn't tremble. My spine had straightened in a way it hadn't in years. For once, my voice didn't try to placate, soften, or vanish. I'd drawn a line, and I felt it settle into the floorboards beneath me, unmoved, unyielding. That morning, Eden tugged my hand as I buttoned my jacket. "Are we going home today, Mommy?" I looked into her hopeful eyes and answered, "Not yet, baby. This time, I want them to hear me before I go." By late afternoon, the mail arrived with a small, beat-up box addressed in handwriting I hadn't seen in years. Brenna tags, a friend from my unit. Inside, tucked between layers of crumpled newspaper, was my service badge. A note read, "Found this mixed in with estate donations at Thrifty Corner on Main. Figured it was a mistake. Sending it where it belongs." I felt my breath hitch. Thrifty Corner was local. My fingers trembled around the badge's edges, worn smooth with time. It had been in my shadow box, along with my discharge papers and medals, things that disappeared when Mom's house was packed up after her funeral. They told me the military had it, that it must have been misplaced. I believed them. But here it was, rescued from a second-hand bin. I didn't need handwriting analysis to know who had made that donation. Later that day, while rummaging through Arthur's desk to retrieve Eden's health insurance forms for school, I spotted a folder marked Delmar Trust. I almost passed it by, but something made me look. Inside, a draft form labeled Renunciation of Claim to Family Trust, filled out, signed, with my name, only it wasn't my signature. The form had been notarized months ago. There was no mistaking the intent. I took it to Arthur, laying it on the table in front of him like an offering neither of us wanted. Were you planning to let this pass without telling me? He stared at the signature for a long moment. I thought, Isolde said you wouldn't be interested, that you had your own life. Your own income. I stared at the man who raised me, who once whispered bedtime stories about justice and honor, and asked, does that justify forging my name? His eyes dropped. I straightened. I served a country that demands signatures in ink and truth, not silence. That evening, the town hosted a small veterans appreciation event at the community hall. I hadn't planned to attend, but after the forged form, the badge in the thrift box, I needed air and an audience. The hall smelled of old wood and pot roast. Locals milled about, shaking hands and sipping coffee from styrofoam cups. Eden clung to my hand, her hair still damp from her bath. Isolde was already there, standing near the podium, chatting in her usual animated way. She wore pearls again, Mom's. Her dress, crisp and pastel, screamed performative grace. When she stepped to the microphone to deliver a short speech on behalf of the Delmar family, I watched from the side with clenched teeth. She praised local heroes, mentioned Arthur, skipped me. When she stepped down, I walked up. My uniform still fit, still bore the threads of time, of desert wind and foreign dirt. I didn't speak to Isolde. I didn't glance at Arthur. I faced the crowd, neighbors, classmates' parents, the mailman, old Ms. Whitaker from the corner house. My name is Venora Delmar, I began, letting the name rest on their ears. And for 20 years I served a country that taught me discipline, courage, and sacrifice. A pause. Some families forget who kept the lights on while they enjoyed peace. Some forget by accident. Others erase with purpose. You could hear the breath being held in the room. Arthur didn't move. His coffee cup quivered slightly in his lap. Eden clapped once, then again. The applause followed, not thunderous, but enough. That night, when I returned home, the house felt colder. My bedroom door was ajar. Inside, drawers were opened. Clothes moved. The hidden envelope from Brenna was untouched, but its position had shifted. Whoever was here had been careful, not careful enough. I stood in the center of the room and said aloud, if you're looking for more things to steal, you'll have to take them from my hands now. I woke to a familiar dread, one that didn't need alarms or nightmares to announce itself. I padded quietly across the hardwood floor, scanning my room like a soldier checking a perimeter. Every drawer pulled open, every photograph studied. Nothing was missing exactly, but everything felt wrong. My military medals lay on the dresser, shifted just enough to remind me someone had been here. Not to take, but to mark a boundary. They were inside my space. They wanted me to know they could still reach in. Later, I found Arthur perched at his kitchen table, a cup of half-cold coffee before him. He mentioned almost offhandedly that the family lawyer had been by that morning. Just routine paperwork updates, he said, not looking at me. I felt a tightening in my chest. That afternoon, Eden knocked gently and slipped a small flyer under the door. I picked it up. Discount long-term stay motels. On the back, in pencil, Arthur's handwriting. If things get too heated. My world tilted. I walked into the living room. Arthur watched my face, avoiding my eyes. He says, "What exactly?" I asked. Isolde whispered from the shadows. He says you'd be happier elsewhere, that this place stirs up too much. I braced myself. It's not about my peace, I said, quiet but loud. It's about your comfort. I grabbed Eden and left. We went to the pediatric clinic for a quick checkup. The nurse greeted us with practiced warmth, but things felt off. When she looked at the forms, she furrowed her brow. I'm sorry, but Eden's already listed under a new school and pediatrician. It says guardianship is with Arthur and Isolde Delmar. I froze. I never signed anything, I said, voice brittle. The nurse pulled out a faxed form, forged signature, clear as daylight, with a contact phone number registered to Isolde's office. My blood ran cold. I grabbed Eden's hand and walked out. Next, I drove to a cafe down the street, safe, public, familiar, the kind of place generals choose to write letters. I connected to secure Wi-Fi, downloaded every file I'd stored to my military cloud, and cross-checked the paperwork available. Every document I ever signed, service records, beneficiary designations, custody forms, layered on my screen in stark clarity. I opened a new doc and began drafting a motion. Protective legal order. Emergency hearing. Prevent misuse of my custody and parental rights. I called my JAG contact, someone who owed me a favor. Their voice crackled with concern. I may need a lawyer, and fast. At the edge of the cafe window, I recorded a video. Not for social media, not for anyone's pity. For the record, just in case. That night, back in the guest room, I lay awake again. Then a knock. The door swung open to reveal an unmarked envelope slipped under. Inside was a blurry photograph of me in uniform, taken last week. No message, just date and time scrawled beneath. A reminder. They wanted me to know. They're still watching. I stared at that photo until the darkness bled into dawn. And I made a vow. They knew where I was, what I wore, when I stood still. And I didn't even know where to start looking back. The thought looped in my mind like a broken record as I held the anonymous photo in my hands, the grainy black and white timestamp glaring at me like an accusation. I felt Eden's small hand slip into mine as I stared out the motel window, but even her warmth couldn't push back the cold realization that someone had been watching me. Not just recently, probably for a while. I didn't tell Eden what the photo meant. I just smiled and told her we'd go out for pancakes later. But first, I had somewhere to be. That morning, mist clung to the trees like ghosts as I drove back to Arthur's house. The garage stood there as plain and unsuspicious as always, but I wasn't fooled. I scanned every corner like I was back in a war zone. And after 15 minutes of moving things around, I found it. A small, camouflaged motion sensor camera mounted above the old workbench, nearly invisible behind a dusty metal cabinet. I pulled it down, heart racing, and shoved the SD card into my pocket like it was evidence from a crime scene. Because it was. Later that afternoon, I visited Gerald, a friend from high school who now ran a small electronics repair shop on the edge of town. He didn't ask questions when I handed over the card. Just loaded the footage on his laptop and turned the screen toward me. Night after night, people came into the garage, rifling, sorting. Rearranging, and there, on the fourth night, was Arthur, my father. He stood in the center of the garage holding Eden's teddy bear, not doing anything else, just holding it, watching it like he was deciding whether to keep it or burn it. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't just about my things, it was about power, about control, it was surveillance. He wanted me to know I could never really be alone, that my past wasn't mine to protect anymore. Driving back, I pulled over in a quiet park and sat under the rustling canopy of half-turned leaves, breathing in the sickly sweet scent of wet earth and betrayal. I opened my phone and dug into the Oregon Public Docket website, scanning every entry related to Eden, myself, the custody mess, and Isolde's attorney. It took less than an hour to find what I needed. There it was. A signed declaration from a third-party witness on the forged custody document. Gregory T. Delmar. Gregory. A cousin I hadn't seen in over 20 years. The same cousin who once offered to help Arthur with some financial paperwork when Mom was too sick to care. I remembered him vaguely. Slick smile, fast talk, always asking questions he already knew the answers to. I whispered out loud, they weren't just erasing me. They were rebuilding the story without me in it. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the mountains and the town turned gold for a few brief moments, the motel room shook. Eden screamed. I leapt from the chair. Outside, smoke. I knew before anyone said it. I knew before the sirens. I knew before the fire truck even turned the corner. The garage was on fire. By the time we arrived, it was mostly ashes. The firefighters were packing up. The blaze had been contained, and strangely, perfectly isolated. The cars? Untouched. The main house? Safe. The bikes and tools? Pristine. But my boxes, every file, every photograph, every piece of me? Gone. Arthur stood silently on the porch. Isolde was giving a statement to a local reporter, sobbing into a tissue with theatrical precision. Family tragedy, she said. Some kind of electrical fault. I walked past the caution tape, past the ruin. The smell of gasoline still lingered beneath the char. One firefighter stepped aside as I passed, subtly slipping something into my hand. It was a half-burned envelope. Inside, just one document had survived, part of an insurance policy. My name had been scratched out. Gregory's initials scrawled next to it, not a trace of hesitation in the ink. Someone was cashing out, and they'd planned to do it before I ever came home. The motel room still smelled faintly of cheap detergent and burned coffee from the lobby pot downstairs, but I barely noticed. I stood outside in the lot, my fingers curled tightly around the half-burned envelope. Arthur's name printed neat and clear, my own scratched out with a sharp pen stroke. It was more than just paper, it was intent, and now it was proof. Red and white emergency lights flickered silently across the lot as the last of the fire crews packed up. Somewhere inside the hum of diesel engines and extinguished flames, I could still hear the echo of Eden's scream. The sound hadn't left me. I doubted it would. I slipped the envelope into my coat pocket. I didn't need more sleep. I needed to be seen. The Veterans Community Hall sat in the heart of town, quiet now, except for a few cars still left in the lot. Inside, tomorrow morning's tribute display would wait. And among the fading lights, a chance to speak without shouting, to stand without being shoved aside. I walked the 3 blocks slowly, my boots skimming along Oregon's damp sidewalk, letting my breath steady with each step. This wasn't for them, not anymore. This was for me. When I stepped into the hall, the faint scent of old wood, coffee, and cleaning polish wrapped around me like a familiar hymn. The place hadn't changed in decades. Rows of folding chairs lined up before the stage, each with a printed name taped to the back. I glanced around and spotted a few I recognized. Mrs. Sims, who taught me how to write checks when I was 12. Reverend Clark, Sergeant Lindley, now retired, who once told me I ran faster than any of the boys. And then I saw it. On the wall of honor, hung with quiet reverence and newly framed, was a photo of me, a real one. Desert sun in my face, a tangle of sand and sweat on my skin, a fellow soldier's hand gripping mine after extraction. Below the photo, etched into a metal plate, were 3 simple words. She saved us. I stood there, not breathing. Put up yesterday, a voice said behind me. I turned to see Mr. Harding, the town's oldest surviving veteran and once the loudest critic of today's military kids. He stood straighter than I remembered, a small nod giving weight to the moment. You deserved it, he added, more than some others around here. The swing of the hall doors broke the silence. Isolde, draped in a black coat and pinched pearls, walked in like the room owed her its gaze. She held a ceremonial pin, the kind given to spouses and siblings at military tributes. She looked from the plaque to me and opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, I stepped forward, alone. And for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone else to acknowledge my place. I claimed it. The hall slowly filled, faces I hadn't seen since childhood, a few younger ones from the town paper, veterans in worn jackets, some in wheelchairs, others upright with age carved deep into their bones. Conversations hushed as a slideshow flickered to life against the far wall. Images rolled. The picnic from last week, Eden sitting on the grass, Mrs. Ginny laughing, Arthur in his Sunday blazer. And then, there it was, a slide titled Honor Roll Families. Beneath the town's logo, rows of names scrolled past. I scanned quickly, and then stopped. Venora Delmar, absent. Gasps were quiet, but real. A man from the back whispered, "She's here. She's standing next to us." I didn't move. I didn't need to. The silence did it for me. I stepped up to the microphone. My boots echoed louder than the slide projector. I was invisible, I began. I was silenced, but not forgotten. I spoke plainly, not with heat, but with gravity. I told them about the missions I ran, not the medals I'd earned. I shared memories of growing up here and the day I shipped off with a handshake instead of a hug. I didn't say Isolde's name. I didn't need to. Every head in that room turned toward her when I said, "Sometimes people don't forget you. They just bury you under their version of the truth." I let the weight of it settle, then I stepped back and walked off stage. Outside, Eden ran to me, her tiny arms wrapping tight around my legs. She looked up, smiling, proud in a way that filled a space I hadn't known was still empty. Arthur stood nearby, his hands clenched into his coat pockets, eyes misting over. For the first time, he didn't look away. We held each other's gaze. I didn't nod. He didn't speak. But something passed between us, like smoke rising from old coals, warmth remembered. I bent down, scooped Eden into my arms, and whispered into her soft curls. "This is only the beginning." The motel ceiling had patterns I'd memorized in childhood, the swirls of paint, the hairline cracks. But they looked different now, or maybe I did. The shadows danced with the moonlight, and Eden's sketchbook rested on my chest like a heartbeat I hadn't noticed until now. I flipped to the last page. A drawing in crayon. 3 figures standing in front of a garage engulfed in red and orange flames. We were holding hands, Eden in the middle, me on one side and Arthur on the other. But she had circled Arthur's face in blue, and underneath, in her uneven handwriting, wrote one word: "Ghost?" The ache hit me before the meaning settled. Even children understood what absence looked like in the shape of a man who never quite stood where he was supposed to. Arthur called that morning. His voice was dry, hesitant. "Would you have coffee with me?" he asked. Not for answers, just company. We met at the cafe by the bluff, the one with chipped mugs and seagull prints on the window glass. He didn't apologize. He didn't need to. Sometimes the truth slips out when we're too tired to hold it back. "I thought erasing your name," he began, fingers trembling around his coffee, "would protect me from my own failure to protect you. When your mother died, I collapsed." Isolde filled the space. I let her. I listened. I didn't speak. He wasn't asking for absolution, just the chance to stop pretending. "I never hated you, Venora," he said, "but I feared the world would, and I let that fear decide your place in this family." I wanted to scream, but I didn't, because something inside me, something I couldn't name, had already begun to melt. Later that day, I found a small envelope tucked into Eden's overnight bag. No stamp, just her name and mine in marker, 2 hearts drawn in the corners. Inside was a letter. "Dear Mama, I heard you cry once in the motel bathroom. I pretended to sleep, but I wasn't. I think it's okay to cry, even if you're a soldier. Soldiers carry heavy things, but you always made me feel light. I used to wonder why Grandpa looked through you instead of at you. I thought maybe you had a magic cloak. But magic cloaks don't make people cry. I didn't know how to ask you why you didn't tell them everything sooner. But now I understand. Some truths have to wait until people are ready to believe them. If you forgive him, I will too. But only if you do. Because I don't want a family that makes you small, Mama. I want one that makes you stay." I pressed the letter to my chest and exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd held since I stepped back into this town. 2 days later, we met at Lila's Hill. It was Eden's favorite overlook, where the Pacific stretched like a secret never fully told. The breeze tangled her hair, and she laughed when it caught her scarf like a sail. Arthur stood beside us, unsure, like a man at the edge of a home he once owned but hadn't visited in years. We didn't talk at first, just sat, let the air do the work. Then quietly, he pulled a photo from his wallet, creased and faded. Me, 10 years old, grinning with a missing tooth, hugging Mom as she held a birthday cake. Eden leaned into me. "That's you?" "That was me," I said. "Still is." Arthur smiled, small and sad. "Yo, your mom always said you'd come home, said she built you strong enough to return no matter how far." We laughed, not all at once, but enough. I didn't offer forgiveness. I offered presence. And for now, that was enough. The sun began to dip, spilling gold across the waves. "Maybe the past isn't something you leave behind," I murmured, wrapping an arm around Eden. "Maybe you fold it and carry it." Arthur's voice came low but sure. "Fold it like a flag." Under the crimson cascade of leaves from the red maple at Lila's Hill, I stood watching Eden and Arthur, 2 generations conversing in the kind of quiet that only comes after the worst storms have passed. Arthur's voice was low, his hands tucked into his cardigan pockets like a schoolboy confessing to the wind. Eden listened, occasionally smiling, occasionally furrowing her brow. I couldn't hear their words, but I didn't need to. The image itself was enough, a beginning, a soft one, but a beginning. When flags are folded, I thought, someone must carry them forward. That evening, back at the motel, I opened the day's mail. Tucked between a pizza coupon and an overdue vet notice for a dog we didn't own anymore was a thick envelope, embossed in deep blue with the insignia of the Women's Archive Foundation. I froze. Inside, a neatly folded letter invited me to speak at their annual symposium on forgotten female voices in American art. The curator had discovered Eden's blog. Apparently, my daughter had quietly uploaded some of my wartime sketches, stories, even an old audio interview I'd given once during a base art therapy project. The words, "We would be honored to have you," sat on the page like a dare. I put the letter down. I didn't touch it again for 3 days. Doubt, as it turns out, doesn't disappear with applause or healing moments. It lingers in the creases. I remembered standing outside gallery doors in my 20s, holding a folio of sketches no one wanted. I remembered the professor who once told me, military girls draw with muscle, not emotion. I remembered throwing those sketches into a box labeled miscellaneous before my first deployment. They never made it back. Eden noticed me packing and repacking the envelope. "Mom," she said, "if you don't tell your story, someone else will. And they'll get it wrong." Arthur, standing in the doorway with 2 mugs of coffee and a look that still carried remnants of remorse, nodded. "Don't look back too long, Nori," he said, using the childhood name I hadn't heard since my mother passed. "You'll miss where you're headed." I didn't respond, but I packed the envelope in my carry-on. The community library in coastal California was modest, tucked into a hillside with ivy climbing the bricks. The symposium was small. No camera crews, no grand stage, just a room of women, mothers and daughters, soldiers and survivors, sitting in folding chairs under paper lanterns and fairy lights. I wore a dark green blouse and slacks, no uniform, no medals, just a single silver flag pin clipped to my lapel. When they called my name, my legs shook. I stepped to the podium and saw faces turn toward me, some gray-haired and weathered, others barely out of high school. All of them waiting, all of them willing to listen. "I used to think being forgotten was worse than being hated," I began. "But I've learned that being erased quietly, being rewritten bit by people you once trusted, carries its own violence." I spoke of art that never found walls, of stories boxed up by shame, of a sister's theft not of money, but of narrative, of a father's silence and how it echoed louder than war zones. "But I am not here to accuse," I said, my voice steadier now. "I am here to exist, fully, publicly, loudly, because women like me weren't meant to fade quietly behind medals or family photos that forgot our names." No one clapped right away. It was the kind of silence that meant they were still holding the words, processing. And then, slowly, they rose. First an older woman with a cane, then a teenager with blue hair, then all of them. Backstage, I sat on a folding chair, wiping my eyes with a napkin from the snack table. The scent of weak coffee and library dust clung to me like comfort. A young woman approached, maybe 22, freckles stretched across her face like a constellation. She handed me a note. "I just wanted to say, your story is mine too," she whispered. "You made me feel visible." The note was scrawled in neat, slanted handwriting. "There's a mural in your honor in the East Bay. You should see it." I pressed the paper to my chest, then looked down at the flag pin on my lapel. It glinted under the fluorescence, worn but unbroken. I didn't pack for a speech. I packed for closure. The train pulled out of the station with a low, familiar hum, a vibration that seemed to rise from the rails and into my bones. Autumn light slanted through the window beside me, casting the kind of shadows that looked like memories. Wrapped in my shawl, I stared out at the blur of houses and warehouses, trees half-turned gold. Every so often, I caught my own reflection, translucent over the scenery, as if I were still learning how to be part of the world again. Eden's letter was folded in my coat pocket. The symposium note still clung to my calendar. But this trip, this journey into East Bay, felt like something separate, something sacred. When the train hissed to a stop, a young woman waited at the platform holding a hand-painted sign that read, "Miss Delmar, this way." She looked barely 20, nerves bubbling under her smile. Her name was Jo. She led me through the city's pulsing rhythm, murals draped buildings, storefronts hummed with poetry and pride. We turned a final corner into an alley that smelled of paint and eucalyptus. "There," she whispered. The mural stretched the length of a building wall. It took my breath, not just in its scale, but in its knowing. My face was there, yes, but not in the stiff formality of uniformed portraits. It was younger, mid-stroke, brush in hand, lips slightly parted as if about to sing. Around me, swirls of color curved like whispers. Eden's tiny shoes, the outline of Arthur's old camera, a folded flag painted in textured, shadowed layers. And there, in a gleam of gold no wider than my palm, was my signature, from a high school art contest I'd forgotten I'd entered. I stepped closer. It wasn't just a mural. It was a memory, rebuilt in pigment. Jo stayed silent beside me, letting the hush stretch long and deep. Then I saw her. Tucked into the lower left panel, near the base of the wall, was a figure that stopped me cold. A girl, not painted with the broad brushstrokes of legend, but with intimacy. Her braided hair, her freckled cheeks, her too big sweater with sleeves pushed up. My sister, Lori. It was her. The likeness was too clear to be coincidence. My chest constricted. Lori had died in 1976, a year that still felt unfinished inside me. No one outside the family knew. No photos of her had ever been shared publicly, yet here she was, painted into the mural like a whispered benediction. I turned to Jo. "How?" She looked both sheepish and reverent. "The artist. They wanted it to be about survival, but not just yours, about everyone you carried with you. They said you'd understand." Tears welled in my eyes before I could catch them. Jo reached into her bag and handed me a sealed envelope. "The artist left this for you. Said not to open it until you'd seen everything." I walked across the street to a small bench under a dogwood tree and opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a sketch, delicate pencil lines on textured paper. Lori, in a field of poppies, head tilted up, laughing. She looked how I remembered her in my dreams. Along the bottom, a handwritten note read, "Some art doesn't need a gallery. Some love doesn't need a name." I clutched the page to my chest and exhaled. Not with sorrow, but with something softer. Release, gratitude, legacy. I opened my journal, the one I'd carried through deployments and motel rooms, and tucked the sketch inside. The page it landed on was titled in my own handwriting, Chapter 1. The sun dipped lower, casting the mural in flame-colored light. I rose and walked back across the street. Jo had stepped away, letting me be. As I turned to leave, a little girl stood near the corner, holding her mother's hand. She looked at me, wide-eyed. "Are you the woman in the painting?" she asked. I smiled, tears drying on my cheeks. "One of them." And as I walked away, a quiet voice inside me whispered, "When legacy blooms on brick and paint, the silence doesn't win." I stood on the rooftop of the Oakland courthouse, black coat hugging my frame against the evening chill. Reporter cameras and hopeful microphones flickered under the growing dusk. In one pocket, Lori's sketch from the envelope. In the other, a flash drive carrying my truth. I stared out at the city lights shimmering like a canvas waiting for its storyline. They wanted to paint me out of history, I thought, heartbeat steadying into resolve. Let's see how they handle the truth in full color. The city's Arts Commission event evolved under string lights and civic pride. Dignitaries mingled, some faces I once admired, others I once feared, each oblivious to the storm gathering at the edge of their platform. I had been introduced as a survivor artist, expected to nod, smile, and fade. Instead, I stepped forward, took the mic, and held their gaze. "This isn't an art show, it's an awakening." I spoke into the cameras, live. I named what they hadn't acknowledged, the erasure of my legacy, the stolen stories, the fear-driven silence of guardians. The buzz of city cameras grew louder, capturing my words. I didn't shout. I commanded, and then I unveiled it. Under the rooftop's twilight, I revealed that I had been the secret patron behind 3 Oakland mural projects, funding artists whose voices had been silenced as mine had been. Pseudonyms shielded me, community uncovered me, the crowd stirred. The mayor's smile wavered. I pressed play on the flash drive, archival footage, yellowing drafts, interviews, journal entries, my life laid bare, full spectrum. The screen bloomed with my story. A rival, rising from the back, interrupted. But I silenced him with a single line, cold and sharpened. "You wrote my name into your gallery. I'm taking it back." Behind me, the screen shifted. A clip of my 1978 mural burning, then restored layer by layer in vibrant color. As smoke gave way to paint, I whispered, "I'm not your footnote, I'm the ink." The city's voice echoed across the rooftop and far beyond. Flashlights snapped as I walked off the stage. Perfectly unbroken, I stepped into the cool Oakland night. Reporters shouted questions into the dark. I answered only once, turning toward Eden, older now and waiting. "History," I said quietly, "was always written by the loudest. Until today. Today, I screamed." The car door closed. Eden's hand slipped into mine. As we drove away, headlights cut through night's canvas, painting our path forward. Sometimes we don't get to choose the stories others write about us, but we do get to choose how we finish them. I spent years trying to make peace with silence, thinking it was strength. But silence can also be survival's slow erasure. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: your truth matters. Even if it shakes rooms, even if it cracks open old wounds, speak it anyway, paint it anyway, because one day someone much younger, maybe even your own child, will look for that truth and need it to feel seen. So here's what I'll leave you with. What are you still silent about? And more importantly, who might suffer from that silence tomorrow? Let's open this up. Drop a comment below. If this story touched something in you, type 1 or share where you're watching from. If it didn't connect, I'd still love to hear why. Your voice matters too. And maybe, just maybe, your comment might be the spark that lights someone else's courage. If this video moved you, inspired you, or even just made you pause, go ahead and subscribe to this channel. We've got more stories coming, stories of strength, truth, and the beautiful mess of being human. See you in the next one.